Good afternoon. Um, Welcome everyone out there who's tuning in today to this live stream conversation that's brought to you in collaboration between Rural Assembly, Southerly, and the Daily Yonder. This conversation about rural climate justice and the storms that hit Texas and the South is part of a collection of live stream conversations that the Rural Assembly has been doing over the past year to address some of the topics that we feel are of most importance to rural communities and populations. And we've tried to bring together through these conversations a real diverse group of respondents and correspondents and speakers who have lived some of the experiences that we're talking about, or speakers who have covered these topics and have some expertise to share with you. So today I'm really excited to present this conversation about rural climate justice. I wanted to also flag for everyone out there listening that we will be having a 2-day virtual event coming up in April. April 20th and 21st is when Rural Assembly Everywhere takes place. And it will be a collection of many more of these conversations, some of them live, some of them recorded, but all of them informative, and many of them would be really exciting and joyful and celebratory around rural culture and experience. So we invite you to register for that event. You can do so at ruralassembly.org/everywhere, and it's free and open April 20th and 21st. So now I'm excited to introduce to you the moderator for this conversation and facilitator, Lindsay Gilpin, who is the founder and editor-in-chief at Southerly. She's also a strategic advisor for the Rural Assembly. So, Lindsay, thank you so much for being here and for holding this panel for us.
Yeah. Thanks, Whitney. I'm excited to be here and talk about this with everyone. So thanks for attending or listening if you're doing so after the fact. The winter storm that we're going to talk about in Texas hit several weeks ago, and it's crazy, to watch the news cycle, fade out and the coverage fade out. And so it's really nice to be able to have a conversation that sort of brings it back into the limelight, at least for some corner of the internet. So I'm really glad we could gather these voices to talk about their experiences and what they know about in Texas and elsewhere in rural areas of the U.S. So just as a recap, in February, a historic winter storm brought record-breaking snowfall and extremely low temperatures across Texas and the southeastern U.S., actually all the way up through Kentucky even, I think. And, millions lost electricity. The latest report for days, the latest report from the Texas Tribune that I read earlier said that I think like 111 people at least have died in the state from various things, mostly hypothermia, but also carbon monoxide poisoning, medical equipment failure, fires, and Jackson, Mississippi, and other local municipality water systems in the region in Louisiana and elsewhere were left without water for a week or more in some cases. Counties and states were really ill-prepared in a lot of ways, I think, for such a storm because it doesn't get that cold generally in this part of the country. And so it really exacerbated a lot of issues and crises in places, that are already dealing with the pandemic and also things like hurricane recovery, right? So today we're here for a conversation with this group to talk about, the intersection of the storms and all of these issues, public health, housing, energy, economic and environmental justice. So I'm excited. I'll just briefly introduce the panel and then I'll promise I'll hand it over to them. So we have Amal Ahmed, who reports on environmental issues for the Texas Observer. She's an incredible journalist, so check her work out. We'll be linking to some of that in the chat. We have John Cooper, Assistant Vice President for Public Partnership and Outreach and the Director of Texas Target Communities at Texas A&M University. We have Dr. Tim Callahan, Evaluation Director for the Southwest Rural Health Research Center at Texas A&M, and Mariannette Pember, who is a national correspondent for Indian Country Today and a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe. So thank you all so much for joining us. And I think first I will just put it to each of you. I'd love to just hear a little bit about where you were when the storm hit in Texas or elsewhere, and kind of your experiences if you had to deal with, the power outages, or if others in your community had to deal with that. I'd love to hear a little bit about that from each of you to take us back to February. Amal, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So I am based in Dallas in the suburbs out here. So yeah, when the storm hit, we were all, kind of caught off guard, I think, just by how badly things got so quickly, in terms of not having power in our house, getting colder and colder, with every hour. But luckily, my parents had just gone to Costco, so we were good on food and all of that, which I know is tough in a lot of these situations to be able to stock up ahead of time when the roads get so icy. But yeah, it was definitely pretty unprecedented. It was very strange to see our, corner of North Texas just blanketed in snow. I went to college in Chicago and I was like, I feel like I'm back there. This should not be happening.
Yeah. And left Chicago to get away from the snow, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Tim, do you want to take this?
Sure. So I am in the Bryan College Station area of Texas, which is about 90 minutes away from Houston and about 3 hours away from Dallas. And overall, I was pretty lucky throughout the storm. The day before the storm, I went to get groceries, but the ice had already started and my car almost skidded off a bridge. But I grew up in the Northeast and I went to college in Minnesota, so I was prepared and was okay with air. But I sort of rode out the storm in my apartment, and the power flickered many times, but luckily never officially went out in my apartment complex. I also got very lucky, though. 75 of the units in my apartment complex had damage by the end of the storm. Mine was not one of them. Many of my friends and colleagues here in the College Station area were on the power grid shutoffs. So what would happen is for the first 2 days, 15 minutes of every hour, they would have power. Which is basically enough time to just charge your phone and to text with friends and maybe to heat up the house a little bit, but you'd have power for 15 minutes on, 45 minutes off. That was the first 2 days. And then for the third and fourth day, it was sort of 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. But it was very idiosyncratic. So I had power. I had friends who lived one street apart, and one of them was part of the power cycling, another was not. So it was sort of very idiosyncratic, but overall, I was very fortunate.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. John, do you want to talk a little about your time that week?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked Tim to go first, because I also live in College Station, Texas, work at Texas A&M, but I was not here for the ice storm. I was actually in Florida, where it was about 75 degrees every day. There's actually a sad story behind that. The reason we were in Florida, we were supposed to go in December, but we didn't get a chance to go because my father-in-law passed away from COVID. And so I would have much rather had, gone to Florida in December and been here for the ice storm, but I was not. Nevertheless, it was still a stressful time for us, not knowing what to expect when we got back home and worrying about our friends and family in Texas. And so we were in touch on a regular basis with our folks back here. And so I can verify everything Tim said. I heard it from other people.
Yeah, definitely. Marinette, I know you aren't in the same area, but I would love to hear just, you covered this during the storm, and I'm sure you were in contact with people who knew what was going on. So you want to talk a little bit about sort of your community and what you reported on during those few days?
Yeah, I'm based in Cincinnati, so we didn't have any personal experience of it, and we cover Indian country, so I did a story about it and did talk to some folks, some people in tribal leadership and to some tribal members down there in Texas. But around that time, I actually was traveling up to Indian Health Service up in northern Minnesota to get my first COVID vaccine, and also to cover Enbridge's Line 3. There's a big controversy that's going across northern Minnesota. And it was like 26 below zero. And on the way, I bought the last pair of snow pants at Dick's. And it's like the smartest purchase I've ever made in my entire life. It was so cold. So, it was, very, although it doesn't seem by that, I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, it didn't seem, just by hearing, the numbers, it didn't seem that cold to me. But for folks who have absolutely, unprepared and, no infrastructure for the cold, it was really hard to hear.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I want to get into that a little bit more. Amal, since you reported quite a bit, like I feel like maybe during while you were still not having power in your house, were reporting, and then afterwards, can you talk a little bit about what sort of stories you were covering, what angle you were covering, and how, just what you saw after the storm and like the types of things that it, exacerbated or made worse in some way?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, it was definitely difficult to kind of break news while it was happening. But I'm totally in awe of all the people who work at, the big daily newspapers here who did a really great job of just kind of capturing what was happening as it was happening. So I think, my reporting plan was very much to think about what are the long-term effects? Like, what do we expect to see? Thinking about this as a disaster, we had a declaration from the governor and then later on from the federal government as well. So just thinking of what kind of similar issues do we see with like hurricanes? To some degree, like you're also talking about like damages to homes and like flooding, from a burst pipe or from like water in your house from the rainwater. Like the damage is to some extent, similar in how we deal with it. So that was kind of what I wanted to think about in the long term. So I did a story on like the housing stock in the South, or in Texas specifically, thinking about how, one reason that we weren't really prepared for this level of cold is because we don't build our houses and our buildings to the standard to keep us safe, right, from that kind of extreme weather. So insulation codes and energy efficiency, it's not something that's really prioritized here, right? So that actually led to more people being unsafe in their own homes when the power went out, right? Which like, if you live somewhere in like Chicago, right, it might be very different, right? Like you may have enough insulation in your home and your pipes are insulated and you have that kind of infrastructure, right? So, as much as we talk about like the grid infrastructure at the state level, there's also a lot of other types of, things that we have to be thinking about with weatherization. So that was one story. And then, also thinking about insurance and disaster relief. Renters are very often, left out a lot of these recovery programs. So, even till today, a lot of people haven't had their pipes fixed, right? So there's a lot of water damage. And so renters are probably more likely to be living in those homes and, not have had any of those problems fixed. In some cases, there was no running water where there were damaged pipes, right, for weeks after. And then the last story that we did that I think is really relevant to this right now. So for Southerly, Carly Berlin and I wrote about the public health messaging that just kind of didn't exist at all the days before the storm, right? So when you think about emergency alerts about, mostly I think people knew that the roads were going to get bad, but there was no warning system set up to tell people, what do you do when it gets this cold? How do you keep yourself warm? How do you avoid carbon monoxide poisoning, right? So earlier you mentioned the official death toll is now at 111. And so a lot of that is from hypothermia and from carbon monoxide poisoning, which, both of those things are just because people got trapped in their own homes in a very dangerous situation. Does that kind of answer your question or did I miss anything there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. And to your point, just about the hurricane recovery, Carly for Southerly had just released this big series about housing issues in hurricane damaged areas in Louisiana. And like that was the week that the winter storm hit. And so she like just went back to those people and, some of their homes where their roof was still off and there was a blue tarp, flapping and there, it was snowing on top of it. And so it's, as these things happen, I think more frequently, you kind of see how they're related. And kind of speaking to that, do you, I just want to put this one to you before I move on. How do you and you've done a lot of speaking on this issue since the storm, I know, and I'm curious how you talk about it in a framing around climate justice and environmental justice and how the types of stories you're writing really illustrate that it's such an issue.
Yeah, so for environmental justice, I think, it's a pretty I mean, to me at least, obvious link, right? When you think of poor housing quality, like low income families and people of color are more likely to be living in, some sort of substandard structure of some kind, right? Or inadequate structure, I think is the term they use. And, so that affects certain people, right, more than others. So I think, and, even if you kind of anecdotally, right, when you think of like the people that kind of own McMansions out in Texas, right, in the suburbs, right, the amount of energy that you needed to keep those homes up before the power went out, right? Like when the grid operators were telling everyone to shut everything down, like turn your thermostats down, right? They were talking to those people, right, like using way more energy than, the folks that live in like poorly insulated apartments, right? And so that was one of the things in that housing story that I did early on, right? In a normal winter, like without these kind of sub-zero, sub-freezing temperatures, people in apartment complexes or in lower quality housing, like they already struggle to pay bills to keep themselves warm, right? So a lot of people, I think Texas actually has the most in the South, of the percentage of people that report feeling uncomfortably cold during the winter in a normal year, right? So that's something that predates the storm, and certainly I think it was exacerbated by it. So that's, when you're thinking of the environmental issue, just year to year, I think that's one really major factor of it. But, in terms of climate change too, ERCOT, our grid here, doesn't use climate change modeling to predict weather events or to plan for its, demand and supply. So I think that layers on to the existing environmental issues, right? I think it's, I think the link between seeing this as a climate event is a little tenuous. I think researchers are still kind of trying to figure out how much of this we can attribute to that. There's some evidence, I think, essentially the cold warm barrier in the Arctic, when that breaks down, we get these polar vortexes. But I think, that's, I don't know, I'm not certainly not a climate scientist, so I wouldn't want to say that definitively. But but regardless, I think that it certainly layers on these existing, disparities.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for explaining that. I want to ask John, just hearing, what Amal's been reporting on and knowing your experience, I'd love to hear from you about what you were seeing in rural communities around Texas and what sorts of resources or issues people were bringing up to, whether it was you or just the state in general, or how do you think that people in rural areas really struggled or responded during this storm?
First, I want to say you mentioned that I work with the Texas Target Communities Program in your introduction. So for the audience, Texas Target Communities Program provides technical assistance on planning and land use, economic development issues in small towns and rural counties across Texas. And as you might expect, in the last year, we haven't had as much kind of on-the-ground interaction with our community partners as we used to. And so I've only spoken to kind of a handful of places, those that we had already started to work with when the COVID struck last year, and a couple that we've had relationships with in the past. And but that said, from the small sample, the things I heard from the small sample, a lot of the stuff probably applies more generally across the board. That said, I heard about failing or inadequate infrastructure, as Amal talked about. I heard about stress on critical facilities and schools, and just about every place we work has some reliance on agriculture for its economic base. And so heard a lot about frozen stock tanks and water troughs and, access to hay. And, there was issues with early season crop damage, the citrus crops in the Rio Grande Valley, for example. And, my mom lost her mustard greens up in Northeast Texas. So, there were those kinds of impacts. I have to say, though, that the thing that resonates most with me is how this event, just like in many other disasters I've dealt with, the impact seems to be affecting a certain group of population disproportionately. These are the folks with the kind of the lowest capacity to mitigate the risks of disasters. In this case, they don't have access to sufficient income or credit to, get out of harm's way or, buy generators to keep the power on. I said I was in Florida, but honestly, and I was concerned about my own house, but my house was built in 2013. I have blown insulation in my attic, and I have the kind of water lines that are made to expand. in the event of a freeze like this. But there are some folks who are not as lucky. Again, as Amal said, they have the hardest time preparing for, surviving, and fully recovering from disasters. Again, and that's troubling enough for me without getting into what they are recovering to. Again, the status quo, what they were dealing with before disasters was arguably unacceptable. As far as the resources I'm offering in a specific event like this, the most I can do is connect people to the folks I know who can help. The Texas Farm Bureau for insurance purposes, for example. And then I have contacts at the USDA. And if it's not clear, let me note that part of my expertise is in disaster planning as well. So I know a lot of people at FEMA and the Texas Division of Emergency Management that I can connect people to when they have questions about, what it means to be in a disaster declaration, what it means to have our county federally declare, who's eligible for the various types of assistance, and where to go when federal and state assistance is exhausted.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm curious then how sort of your response to what Amal was talking about, which is this kind of public health messaging that's really good in some respects, right? Like even if there isn't a ton of warning for a storm, but also is severely lacking, and especially for more vulnerable populations in general. And so I would love to hear what you think about that and sort of the response at the federal and state level during this storm, and also just more generally when it comes to giving people enough information so that they have time to act and can act.
Yeah, by definition, these types of events, disasters, are things that you don't totally plan for. They catch you off guard, right? It's something you didn't anticipate. Although there are things that we can anticipate because they seem to happen over and over again. I think in my experience, I've discovered that disasters are like focusing events, right? They help places, especially those impacted by disasters, zero in on not wanting this to happen again. I think in some of the places that I've talked to, the disaster exploited not just their weaknesses in the infrastructure, but also in their communication systems, right? When the power went out, they weren't able to, local officials weren't able to communicate with their constituents as effectively as they would normally. And that's not to say that, communication, modes of communication, ways of communication in rural areas are optimal in non-disaster times, but issues about rural broadband is for another conversation. Somebody else can talk about that. But yeah, it exposes the weaknesses in the system. And I think after disasters, there's a lot of discussion, albeit performative in some instances, about things we can do to not let this happen again. In my fervent hope, my earnest hope is that people will take heed of these lessons and try to do better the next time. So.
Yeah, definitely. I want to go to Mariannette. I'm curious if you want to talk about just more generally, if we're talking about front lines of climate change and in disasters like this. I mean, indigenous communities are way up there, and so I'd love to hear from you about sort of what you were saying. You talked a little bit about the storm, but more generally, what it looks like with preparing for climate change and also other environmental injustices in Native American communities across the United States. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I did want to say, actually, in reporting on this, I called up, tribal leadership as I could, and tribes are sovereign entities, and they don't really have to talk to you. They're not, necessarily within their constitutions. They don't have these kinds of same transparency requirements that other governments have. But some folks did talk to me, and they reported it was very tough, and they were struggling. I called up the Isleta Pueblo, which is near El Paso. And they said, nah, we're okay. It's been kind of cold. And I'm like, what the heck? What's up with that? And it turns out that they are part of a different grid, a different power grid. They're not part of this ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They're actually part of the El Paso Electric grid. And that made all the difference for them. Apparently, the El Paso grid had actually planned, and done some, some work several years ago. Versus, from what I don't do a whole lot of reporting about Texas power grids, but my understanding is that, people really felt that this Electric Reliability Council of Texas was not very transparent about a lot of their decisions, and people really felt that it was very inequitable, the decisions that they made about, where to use these rolling blackouts. So, people who, some of the other tribal leaders that I spoke to, for them, 60 degrees is a cold snap, and they didn't have the clothing for it. People also cook with electric, so they couldn't even heat anything up. And then people also didn't have water, and it's kinds of things that one doesn't think about until, you're so dependent upon these things. But, one of the things that was leadership, I think, from the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians, Lance Soto, he just very much took it in stride. His house was the only house on the reservation that had electric, and people were just coming over to his house, charging up their phones and stuff. And he said, Native people are used to being on their own. I mean, we don't normally have help at all from either state or federal governments. Not to say that we don't suffer, of course, but so it's just sort of an ongoing, I think, a problem, that they saw there. So yeah, in general, what I'm seeing, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm covering Enbridge's Line 3, which they're billing as a replacement project for a pipeline, and they want to run oil through this, and tar sands oil through it, and they are billing it as a replacement. In fact, they're just building a whole new pipeline so they can put tar sands through it, and they can do it under pressure. And it's going through treaty territory, it's going through some reservation land. And, like other communities, some Native folks are for it and some are against it. Some people have gotten, Enbridge has paid a lot of money, to actually the Fond du Lac Band for this easement, for this route through their reservation. But a lot of people are expressing concern about the potential impact upon wild rice, which is really important to Ojibwe people who are in northern Minnesota, and the potential impact upon, the environment and wetlands. But it's more about this far-seeing kind of vision, which capitalism is, very much, I think, very much on the short term, the immediate reward, and this reliance on these non-renewable, energy sources is just, it's not going to end well. Let's put it that way, in the long run. And so I'm, seeing tribes, a lot of tribal leaders, and bonding, I think, with environmentalists in that they're seeing this. And that's really some of the big opposition to projects like Enbridge's Line 3 and their big mainline system, is just this lack of vision. This whole extraction sort of mentality, it's so embedded in some communities, particularly when we look in northern Minnesota, where first it was trapping, and then timber, and then mining, and then now it's pipelines. Just this. So to get folks to take a step back a little bit, and so many of these things are framed, I think, particularly by the industry, as a black and white either or, that we're just going to snap off we're going to cut off, these fossil fuel sources. But, I think folks that are interested in, transition are saying, no, it's going to be incremental, but we do need to make a decision. And I think that, I'm really seeing a lot of Indigenous people taking the lead on this as we experience, the negative impacts of climate change.
Yeah, definitely. And hearing you say that, I was just thinking about how oftentimes, with coming at these topics they're sometimes controversial from a public health perspective, or just your community's health perspective is really useful, and can kind of cross a bridge that might be hard to cross when you come at it from straight environmental perspective, or climate change. And so I'd like to ask, Tim, if you could talk about that a little bit, just sort of your kind of understanding of these sorts of disasters like the storm, and how these things are public health issues and how you communicate that and think about that.
Yeah, so I think here in Texas, between Hurricane Harvey hitting Houston, a few years ago, as well as this winter storm, public health has been increasingly forced to recognize that climate issues, natural disasters, and climate change in general are public health problems. And the broader public health community is increasingly recognizing this as well. We need to recognize that this comes in a lot of different ways. Some of them are pretty simple, right? As temperatures rise globally, you're more likely to have things like heat stroke, which will result in hospitalization. You're more likely to see influences on things like crop yields, which influence issues related to hunger and malnutrition. Related to the weather-related disaster we experienced with the winter storm, there was a reduced capacity to get to needed medical care. If you needed medical care, whether it's COVID or anything else, if you needed to get to a hospital or a doctor, the roads were impassable for a few days, and that wasn't possible. And just as it was impassable for you, it was also impassable for some ambulances to get to you, or for, let's say you need home health care, a home health aide. They can't get to you either in some cases. So that can be very problematic from a health perspective. You also need to recognize the role that electricity and power plays in keeping people healthy, right? So to the extent that you have various medical devices that you need to keep operational, that can be very challenging in the context of a storm that knocks out power for several days, whether that's a hurricane or a winter storm. Some of it's really simple, right? So, if I like I said, I grew up in New England. I went to school in Minnesota. I'm used to snow. I'm used to things like that. But there's no salt, there's no sand, there's no plows, which means there's lots of people who are out on essentially sheets of ice who are slipping and falling and hurting themselves, and they can't necessarily get to medical care to get the help that they need. For example, I walked my dog and my dog pulled me down on the ice and messed up my knee a little bit, right? These things happen. Many in Texas were without drinkable water, right? And that's a fundamental feature of life. If you don't have drinkable water, that becomes problematic from both the perspective of being able to drink it, as well as, you can't do things like flush the toilet, right? These are basic human needs that weren't able to be met. Hunger was another issue. I had friends, very well-off friends, who had not prepared for the winter storm, who, 3 or 4 days in, didn't have any food in the house and had to make the choice of, do I not eat today? Or do I go and stand in line at the grocery store for 3 or 4 hours in 10-degree temperatures, hoping I could get inside to get food? And then finally, housing. Public health is increasingly recognizing the social determinants of health. There's several social determinants of health. One of them is housing. And to the extent that people had, like we heard, the blue tarps over their houses from Hurricane Harvey, that's potentially serious. And to the extent that your house is, 10 degrees because there's been no power for 4 days, it's no different than being outside at that point, right? So you don't have that housing security you would need. So there are a ton of ways that we're starting to recognize that public health interacts with climate. And I think it's something that public health is going to need to increasingly grapple with over the next decade or two.
Yeah, those are all great points. I wonder if you could, I want to switch gears a little bit as we move through the end of this conversation to talk more about solutions and responses to things like this, since we know they're coming, maybe not always a winter storm, but we should be getting more prepared for things of this nature. From what you're talking about, Tim, what sorts of resources or policy changes do you think are the most immediate that you're thinking about in Texas and just more generally?
Yeah, I think the two that stand out most immediately are sort of disaster preparedness as well as infrastructure. On a disaster preparedness front, we now have had, 2 once-in-a-century events in the past 4 years here in Texas. We need to recognize, okay, maybe these aren't once-in-a-century events anymore, right? And to the extent that that's true, we need to have good plans in place for what to do when these things happen, right? We need to understand where the people in need are, how to get resources to those people, and to do so in a timely manner. We need to be planning in advance and have contingency plans. We need to have thought these things through. What's the worst case scenario and how can we plan against it? So I think that's the disaster preparedness side. On the infrastructure side, I think Texas political leaders learned their lesson, hopefully, related to having their own electric grid and the potential problems related to that and not planning ahead. Infrastructure is a lot of things, though. It's the fact that in this entire state of Texas, there aren't many snowplows. They aren't usually needed, right? But when they are needed, it's a problem that they don't exist, right? You literally could not drive through Bryan College Station. When people think College Station, they think it's a small town. There's 250,000 people who live here, right? So it's a pretty big area. It was pretty impassable for several days, right? So I think the infrastructure and I think the preparedness are the two most important things from a policy perspective we need to be working on. We can't wait for the next event to happen. We need to be proactive.
Yeah, definitely. John, what do you have something you want to add to that, just about what policies or specific issues you're thinking about, especially in rural Texas?
Yeah, I'm just listening to Tim talking, and I'm reminded that a lot of my closest collaborators over my time have been public health people. And I've taken to talking about disaster vulnerability and the characteristics that the most vulnerable people experience as comorbidities, right? There are things that characterize certain people and make them more vulnerable to disasters, and it's the same in any disaster. Whether the person whose house is not able to withstand a hard freeze is likely living in a house that can't withstand the extreme forces of a flood or a hurricane, right? The same people who can't stockpile food in the event of a freeze won't be able to last very long in the aftermath of a hurricane, right? And so we see these things over and over again. And I mentioned earlier that I think sometimes the reactions of our leaders, politicians, elected officials, and others after disaster, they quickly go to kind of the assigning blame and finger pointing. That's what I meant when I talked about kind of the pejorative interest in doing more about this. And unfortunately, this event happened. This was a crisis in the midst of a crisis, right? And a lot of the places that I've talked to, I feel like they've gone back to dealing with slowing the spread of COVID, providing access to vaccinations and opening up schools and that kind of stuff. While I don't know if I'm as confident in our elected officials at the state level, because I think the recriminations are still flying. The dust hasn't settled there yet. I will note that at least in one place, the COVID crisis actually enhanced the local response because the pertinent people were already gathering and coordinating in response to COVID, and they just the freeze kind of diverted their attention temporarily. But I think in terms of policy, for me right now, I'd love to see, and I understand that people can deal with one crisis at a time. It seems like, but for me, I think the most immediate need is for kind of full assessment of what worked and what didn't work, so that information can be used to inform an overarching kind of resilience plan, the kind of plans that Tim talked about, and hopefully sooner than later. I should say that, I know for a fact that there are people in the Texas General Land Office who were working on a program to foster more resilience across Texas. And that's welcome news in a state that's not really known for planning. And that planning started, for that program started before the freeze. And so I think the freeze just validates the need for more resilience planning, more thoughtful planning in advance of these kinds of events.
Yeah, well said. Marionette, what about you? What do you think should be policies and priorities, both within tribes and also just federally, to help tribes navigate through these, because they're on the front lines in so many of these communities with sea level rise, fires, that sort of thing. What's really important to you, and what are you looking towards while you're reporting?
Wait, can you kind of reframe that? I'm not really sure what you're asking.
Oh, yeah. I was just asking what, from a tribal perspective, what should some of the policy priorities be, both, internally, I think, as more tribes have to deal with more climate change effects, but also, federally, what do you see as really important policy-wise?
Well, I think, built into like the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers is often responsible for these various permitting processes regarding water and the impact on the environment. It does have built-in language about meaningful consultation with tribes. But it doesn't really happen, and there's really no enforcement of it, and nobody gets to define what meaningful means. Often it's sending a letter, and it's not even usually addressed to, it's just dear tribal leadership, and that's kind of where it goes. Actually, I'm just writing now about this Polymet mine, this proposed copper and nickel mine on the St. Louis watershed, the headwaters actually in northern Minnesota. And they actually, it was a nonprofit that was an advocacy group that was able to uncover through a FOIA request that, during the Trump era, he had appointed folks at the EPA at the district level who were just instructed not to talk about these things. And, the whole permitting process, this meaningful consultation, it really doesn't happen. Tribes are not viewed, as the sovereign entities that they are, as independent nations that they are. Of course, there are problems with, tribal leadership. Tribal leadership, they're politicians, they're elected politicians. And like elected politicians everywhere, they may have interests that differ from their citizenry. So, and unfortunately, there aren't a lot of internal processes within tribes about citizens to hold their leadership to the feet to the fire. So it can be super difficult. When you really, I don't know, as the more work that I do, the more that I think tribal constitutional reform may be the single most important issue for tribes right now. But it's so difficult. These things have become entrenched. This sort of partisanship and. It's really, there's all these sorts of bad activities, but, it's like expecting people who have very limited resources to take the long view when you have nothing to offer them. It's, they're going to rely more on these, I think, immediate rewards. So I guess that would be it, really meaningful consultation. We're seeing right now that Biden he's taken a look at this EPA permitting process, and that's super important, So I think that that's really good, and I'm hoping to see good results from that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Amal, I want to ask you the same thing, just what you're looking at now that we're a few weeks out from this storm, and you're probably going to continue reporting on things that come of it. What policies and priorities and just things are you watching as you're covering this?
Yeah, I think one area that we're still really looking at, right, is just the communication between various levels of government, right? So you have cities and counties to the state, to the federal government, right? And it seems like there was certainly a major breakdown, in terms of communicating the risks as they were happening. Obviously things are moving fast, but it certainly seems like a lot of that communication of that risk could be better. And also just how the state kind of prepares for these types of disasters, right? In terms of where do they send resources? Where do they kind of stockpile things? How is all that planned? I think, John and Tim kind of discussed this, right? There's a real lack of resiliency and disaster management, I think, in Texas. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that needs more scrutiny, and the way that these plans are developed and communicated, I think, it's like the major thing. Yeah,
definitely. And really, I think journalism has such a role in that too, to better inform people ahead of time or afterwards what it all means. And so I think that's why it's cool that we're having this conversation together. Sorry, my dog is barking. I don't know if you can hear that. She's decided to do that right now. So we have a couple questions from the audience, and one is from Mary Sketch, who she asked really about kind of, because so much of the country is coming face to face with natural disasters at this really scary pace. It's a lot more people, I think, are coming around to accept climate change and not denying it, or maybe, calling it something different, but really wanting to take action on it. But she says at the same time, political division obviously is at an all-time high, and that makes it really hard to have those conversations. So how do you all reconcile this in your work and in how you communicate about this issue? And what do you feel is your role in this space, as a researcher, John, or as a journalist, Marion and Amal? Anyone can take it.
We can try to. So is it just kind of like, how do we talk about climate risks, I guess? And
yeah, or if there's, I guess it really, how do you sort of work out how to communicate that better and talk about that in an effective way that can actually get people to want to take action in their community or prepare in some way. Is that changing at all now that there are more of these disasters to report on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think my approach has always been like, well, you know, I think also just given where I work right at the Texas Observer, like we really don't have to like mince words or kind of be careful about how we talk about climate change, right? Like we can just call it what it is, right? Or when a politician kind of lies about green energy causing this, right? Like we can just call that what it is, right? So I think that's really useful. But I think kind of the big thing in a lot of this coverage is still kind of walking people through the layers of like injustice. So, you know, like we were talking about earlier, all sorts of disparities that play out. So I think that's kind of where I tend to try to be more careful, or I'm pushed by my editors to kind of explain that more and walk people through that issue. And I think that when you can do a really good job of capturing the human impact and how the systems that we've built affect, you know, families and people, I think that's kind of where you start to see people who maybe otherwise would dismiss this, be like, oh, like this could happen to me or my community, right? I don't know if that totally answered the question, but that's kind of how I think of that issue.
I'll just add that, you know, if you talk to people at FEMA, they will let you know that there's a disaster somewhere in the U.S. just about every day of the year, right? And the truth is, people don't think it will happen. You know, it don't happen where they are, where they live. And I think the what was implied, or maybe she said this directly in Mary's question. She said it feels like the frequency and severity is increasing. That's actually true. I mean, you get data to show that. And so while I don't get into the weeds when I'm talking about climate issues either, but I talked before about how disasters can be focusing events. And so I like to catch people right after a disaster has happened, you know, especially if it impacted them directly. But even if they were just close to it, people get it. They know that it can happen here, right? Especially if it just happened. And then they're more apt to try to do something about it, right? But again, there's a window of opportunity for that. Once that window closes, you kind of have to wait for the next time to where people, you know, get their come to Jesus event or their whatever they're focusing. Wait, however you frame it. You know, if I'm talking about kind of other issues, I just use their experience, right, to drive home the point, because it's got to be relevant, it's got to be salient. They've got to have a value proposition. So a lot of it depends on framing.
Yeah, and I would just add to everything that John just said, you know, I think the two things that we know tend to be most persuasive are, one, stories, right? So having focusing events that sort of demonstrate to individuals why this issue matters and what needs to be done can be critical. The other thing is, from a research perspective, you need to recognize that despite how political some issues are, like climate or vaccination or whatever it might be, they just need to lead with the evidence. Right? Lead with the data, lead with the evidence, and say, you know, politicians might try to frame this one way or try to frame it the other way. I'm just going to present you with the facts. And if we present you with the facts and we present you with stories of real people who've gone through these things together, that can be a pretty persuasive message.
And I feel like Tim said this, but I just want to reiterate it. You can get facts from formal sources, but especially helps if you can get facts that are grounded in the local context, right? Based on the knowledge of the folks who live there. And nothing's better than kind of their lived experience. Right?
Yeah, definitely. We have one other question in the chat that I got from Larry Linenschmidt. And he said the last number I saw for the agricultural losses of the storm was 600 million. And I just Googled it real quick and I saw, oh, there's a Texas A&M like release that said 600 million. So he said, is that the latest? Are there any updates, or do you all have any sense of sort of the just agriculturally in general with this storm, what was lost or what the consequences might be? I hadn't really thought about that too much, so I'm eager to hear if you know. Maybe. Go ahead.
I'll admittedly say it's sort of beyond my purview in public health. Texas A&M is one of the biggest agricultural schools in the country, so I would sort of trust what our ag experts say. You know, the only thing that even comes to mind for me to say maybe it'll be more is it's only sort of March, so the true impact on crop yields for the coming year might be too soon to know for sure. But that's my perspective on it. I trust our ag experts.
Yeah, definitely. But it's a really good thing to think about. I think sometimes, that's one of the issues, unless you're consistently a farmer or consistently talking and reporting on it in that world, the long-term effects of something like that happening in February can't, like you're saying, you don't know for a long time. So it's a good point to bring up. Someone else asked about really what you all have heard about rural immigrant experiences during the storm, or just in general, like what sort of coverage have you seen? What sort of issues have been brought to light around that? And, not just on the border, but in general in rural immigrant communities, and how do we support that response for them better?
Talk a little bit about this. So, I mean, I didn't actually write the story, but another one of my colleagues at the Observer has written quite a bit about the colonias in the Valley, and how a lot of those communities, are facing issues like poor housing structures and, very poor sewage and water infrastructure. And so, just thinking of that, like community and the way that like a spring flood or summer flood affects them, right? Like just the winter storm and the pipe damages and all that, it must have been pretty bad. I mean, I actually haven't seen a ton about that, but there's definitely something to think about, and just reminds me it's one more story that we gotta add to the list of things to do. But yeah, I mean, I know from my reporting, not necessarily in rural areas, but a lot of undocumented folks, at least one woman I talked to expressed feeling fear, in terms of going to a public shelter or asking for help. So that's certainly an issue that I think, a lot of communities in Texas are facing, and certainly not helped by kind of the climate that we have around that. So yeah, that's not specific to rural communities, but certainly another issue.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I'm also thinking of, this is obviously not the winter storm, but Hurricane Matthew that hit northeastern North Carolina in 2016 really impacted farming communities out there, and where a lot of immigrants, Latinx immigrants were housed. It was flooded and they were stranded for days. And this just sort of brings up again how, the same populations, as you all know, are in the direct line of all of these things, whatever shape they take. So I think that's super important, and also gives me some story ideas. Well, I think I don't see any more questions in the chat, unless you all have anything else you want to throw out at the audience, or plug for anybody. Feel free to jump in and do that. But if not, I just am very grateful for you all to come here and have this conversation. Again, I think it's so important to keep talking about these things once they fade from the news cycle. So thank you for coming and sharing your expertise. And maybe just, right before we go, if you all could briefly just say what can you leave local rural leaders with in this moment, in terms of resources or things to kind of pay attention to? Is there anything top of mind for you all right now, especially for rural, as we, move past this storm and into the rest of 2021? What are you really thinking about when it comes to rural communities?
Yeah, I'll just say that there's a lot of optimism among my peers, my networks, people who work with, advocate for rural communities, that there will be more opportunities for rural people and places under President Biden. Some of them have even been working on letters of guidance and support, with including promising ideas and strategies from the field that they hope will be considered as decisions are made about how to act on a rural agenda. So I just want to say that I am hopeful that some attention will be paid to the needs in rural communities.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing that, John. Well, if there's nothing else, I again thank you all so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with the group, and thank you all for watching wherever you are. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a lovely day and join the Rural Assembly again. Thanks, guys.